Sometimes the cruelest wounds are invisible. Sometimes a smile is not joy, but armor. And sometimes the monster who finally sees you is the one who learns to become human. The bargain had been sealed in ink and blood, a human princess for a century of peace. Celeste had been the price, the sacrifice, the lamb offered to the wolf. Alaric, king of the Nocturne court, had expected a queen, a partner worthy of his ancient throne. What he received, in his estimation, was a songbird, a creature of mindless, twittering cheer whose frivolity was an insult to the ancient, silent stones of his castle. He had brought her to his kingdom of shadow and starlight, a place carved from the heart of a mountain and the soul of a long, cold night, and he was determined that she would learn its gravity, its weight, its unforgiving permanence. He would be the one to teach her. He would be the one to tame the maddening, thoughtless light in her eyes. For 6 months, the lesson was relentless. His cruelty was a finely honed instrument, precise and devastatingly public. He called her his little featherhead before the assembled court, his voice a silken venom that coiled around the words, making them a mockery, a diminishment. He corrected her speech, her posture, her very laughter, his critiques delivered with the detached air of a man training a particularly stubborn animal, something beneath him, unworthy of his patience. He gave her ladies-in-waiting who were mirrors of his own disdain, their eyes cold and watchful, their hands quick to adjust her gown or her hair with a barely concealed impatience that spoke volumes. He treated her as a child, a beautiful, vacuous doll that needed to be taught its place, which was in silence, at his side, an ornament to his power, nothing more. Their marriage had never been consummated. He had made it clear, in 1,000 wordless ways, that he found the very idea distasteful. Another small cruelty she had absorbed in silence, adding it to the collection of wounds she carried inside. They maintained separate bedchambers, connected by a heavy oak door that remained perpetually closed, a border between his world of cold control and her prison of loneliness. Celeste absorbed it all with a baffling, infuriating resilience that drove him to distraction. She met his sharpest barbs with a breathless, startled blink, as if the cruelty were a language she couldn't quite parse, a foreign tongue whose meaning escaped her. She endured his public humiliations with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, a bright, brittle shield she held up against him, a defense he couldn't penetrate and therefore despised. Her flightiness, the very thing he sought to crush beneath the weight of his authority, seemed only to intensify under pressure. She would chase dust motes dancing in a rare sunbeam slanting through a high castle window, her fingers outstretched, like a child reaching for starlight. She would hum nonsensical tunes while walking the cold, echoing corridors, filling the oppressive silence with sounds that grated against his nerves. She would arrange wildflowers she'd somehow found growing in a crack of stone into a cheerful bouquet for their oppressive, monolithic dining table, splashes of color that seemed obscene against the gray solemnity of his world. Each act of lightness was a splinter under his skin, sharp and impossible to ignore. It felt like defiance. It felt like a deliberate refusal to understand the weight and solemnity of her new reality, of him, of the honor he had bestowed upon her by making her his queen. He was a king of an ancient and powerful lineage, his life a tapestry of duty, conquest, and eternal vigilance against those who would see his kingdom fall. Her presence was a discordant, frivolous note in the grand, somber symphony of his existence, an insult to everything he had built. He was determined to silence it, to break her of this maddening refusal to acknowledge her circumstances. The breaking point arrived on a storm-lashed evening, when the wind screamed around the castle's spires like a soul in torment, when the rain hammered against ancient stone with the fury of the heavens themselves. A delegation from the Sunstone Confederacy, a human kingdom of tedious piety and considerable wealth, had departed that afternoon, their carriages disappearing into the tempest. During the final negotiations, Celeste had laughed. It was not a demure titter, carefully modulated to be inoffensive, but a genuine, bubbling peal of amusement at a clumsy turn of phrase from one of the portly ambassadors. The sound had rung through the hall like a bell, clear and unbidden and utterly inappropriate. In that moment, surrounded by the stern, pale faces of his court and the sanctimonious humans who held their treaty in their soft, mortal hands, Alaric had felt a rage so pure and cold it was almost sublime, almost transcendent. He saw her not as his queen, but as a saboteur, actively undermining his authority with her careless, childish joy. That night, in the tense silence of their chambers, the storm outside was a pale echo of the tempest brewing within him. She was humming again, that same infuriatingly cheerful little tune, as she unpinned her hair before a silver mirror, each note like a needle against his already frayed patience. The sound grated on his every nerve, scraping against the last vestiges of his control. "Must you?" he snarled, the words sharp as a whip crack in the quiet room, cutting through her melody like a blade. Celeste's hands froze in her hair, still tangled in the pins. She looked at his reflection in the mirror, her eyes wide with that familiar, maddening innocence. "My lord?" "That noise. It is incessant, relentless. Do you have nothing in your head but air and foolish melodies?" He moved across the room with predatory grace, his long shadow devouring the candlelight, swallowing the warmth. He was a hunter, and he felt the ancient, terrible instincts stir in his blood. Instincts he had not felt toward her before. Instincts that whispered of dominance and submission. He wanted to see fear in her eyes, true fear, the kind that would finally shatter that impenetrable shield of cheerfulness. He wanted to see her finally break, to bend, to understand. "It is just a song," she whispered, her voice small, fragile as glass. "I meant no—" "It is an annoyance," he countered, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous, a growl from something inhuman. "Just as your constant, mindless smiling is an annoyance. Your laughter today was an embarrassment. Do you understand that? You made a mockery of me before our allies. You are a queen, not a tavern wench. When will you learn the meaning of dignity? When will you learn your place?" She stood then, turning from the mirror to face him directly, and for the first time in 6 months, a flicker of something other than placid cheer crossed her face. It looked like defiance, small and fragile, but defiance nonetheless. "I meant no harm, my lord. I only—" "You never mean anything," he spat, the injustice of it all, the political marriage forced upon him, her infuriating, incomprehensible spirit, his own loss of control, coalescing into a single point of white-hot anger that threatened to consume him. "That is the problem. You are a hollow, gilded thing, a play-acting queen with nothing of substance inside, nothing of worth." He saw her flinch, a tiny, satisfying tremor that ran through her frame, and something dark in him savored it. He stepped closer, crowding her, using his size and his power to force her back against the heavy oak wardrobe, trapping her. He wanted to shatter that placid facade, to make her feel the weight of his displeasure, to force her to see him, to acknowledge him. He reached for her, his hand intending to grip her arm, to shake her, to wake her from this dream she seemed to live in where nothing touched her. But his hand tangled in the delicate silk of her sleeve. In his rage, his grip was iron, unforgiving, the strength of something immortal and terrible. The fabric, no match for a vampire's frustrated fury, gave way with a sound like a tearing scream, a ripping that seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. It tore from her shoulder down to her waist, the delicate brocade parting like paper, exposing the smooth, pale skin of her back to the flickering candlelight. And the world stopped. The storm outside, his own thundering pulse, the very passage of time, it all ceased. There was only the ruined silk hanging in his clenched fist, the candlelight dancing over her exposed skin, and the story written there in scar tissue and old pain. It was not the flawless, unmarked canvas he had expected, not the pristine flesh of a pampered princess. Her back was a latticework of old scars, a map of violence so extensive, so thorough, that for a moment his mind refused to comprehend what he was seeing. They were not the clean lines of a battle-worn warrior, earned in honorable combat, but a chaotic, overlapping tapestry of healed brutality. Thin, silvery lines crisscrossed thicker, puckered welts that had never fully flattened. Some were thick and raised, the kind that never truly heal, while others had faded to whisper-thin lines, all of them old, all of them speaking of years, not months. They covered her from the delicate nape of her neck to the gentle curve of her waist, a history of systematic cruelty etched into her very flesh. Alaric stared, his hand still clenched in the ruined fabric, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. The rage vanished, extinguished as if doused in ice water, leaving behind only a horrified understanding that bloomed cold and sharp and utterly devastating. He saw the scars, and suddenly, with a clarity that was almost unbearable, he saw her. He saw the flighty girl who chased sunbeams, and understood she was not escaping duty or mocking solemnity, but seeking a moment of warmth and light in a life that had been so very cold and dark. He saw the woman humming to herself in echoing halls, and knew it was not foolishness or empty-headedness, but a way to fill a silence that had once been filled with menace, with the sounds of approaching footsteps and closing doors. He saw the bright, brittle smile and recognized it for what it truly was, a desperate, practiced shield, armor worn by someone who had learned that showing pain only invited more of it. She had been meticulous about her modesty, he realized with a sickening lurch, always wearing high-necked, long-sleeved gowns, always dismissing servants before undressing, always changing in the privacy of shadow. He had thought it prudish propriety, another mark of her provincial upbringing. It had been protective concealment, a survivor's careful hiding of evidence. He had called her a spoiled featherhead. He had accused her of knowing nothing of hardship, of weight, of darkness. He had tried to discipline her, to break her spirit, to teach her the meaning of fear and obedience, to force gravity upon her. A choked, guttural sound escaped his throat, the sound of a man confronting the full magnitude of his own blindness. He, Alaric, king of the Nocturne Court, who prided himself on his perception and control, who had ruled for centuries through his ability to see the truth beneath the surface, had been nothing but a clumsy, brutish echo of the monster who had done this to her. He had been trying to break a woman who was already broken, shattered and painstakingly reassembled, and who had spent every single day of her life courageously, impossibly, putting the pieces back together. He released the dress as if it had burned him, the silk slithering to the floor in a whisper of ruin, pooling around her feet like shed skin. Celeste stood frozen, her back to him, her shoulders trembling with the effort of remaining upright. She was not crying. The silence that stretched between them was absolute, heavier than any stone in his ancient castle, more suffocating than any darkness. He could not breathe, he could not speak. What could he say? "I am sorry" was a meaningless puff of air, an insult to the magnitude of what he had done, what he had failed to see. He saw his own reflection in the silver mirror beyond her shoulder. A monster, his face a mask of dawning horror, his eyes wide with the terrible recognition of his own cruelty. And he saw her, small and terribly still, exposed in every way that mattered. The physical act of tearing the dress was nothing, a triviality. The true violation was that he had laid bare her most fiercely guarded secret, the shame she had hidden from the world, and in doing so, had revealed the utter monstrosity of his own blindness. He had taken her survival, her light, her humming, her small acts of joy, and called it a flaw. He had taken her strength and named it weakness. Slowly, deliberately, moving as if through deep water, he took a step back, then another. He did not offer comfort. He had forfeited that right in 6 months of calculated cruelty. To touch her now would be a profanation, a desecration of something sacred that he had nearly destroyed. He simply retreated, pulling his monstrous presence away from her, giving her back the space he had so violently invaded, restoring the boundary he should never have crossed. He turned, his movements stiff and mechanical, and walked out of the room, closing the heavy doors behind him with a soft, funereal click that echoed like a death knell. He left her there, alone with the ruins of her dress and the sudden, terrible silence of his dawning repentance. The king did not sleep. The eternal stillness that was his rest, the suspended animation that passed for a vampire's slumber, offered no sanctuary from the images seared into his mind like a brand. He stood on the highest battlement of his castle, the wind-whipped rain cold and brutal against his unfeeling skin, and saw nothing but the pale map of her pain, the topography of her suffering laid bare. Every cruel word he had ever spoken to her returned to him like a flock of ravens, each one a fresh lash against his own conscience, each one revealing itself for the weapon it had been. Featherhead, child, gilded thing, mindless, worthless. He had sought to tame her, to bend her to his will, believing her spirit to be an untempered, frivolous thing in need of discipline. The arrogance of it was staggering, almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. He had mistaken a survivor's desperate coping mechanisms, her joy, her lightness, her determination to find beauty, for a spoiled princess's whimsy. Her lightness wasn't an absence of depth. It was a defiance of gravity itself, a refusal to be pulled down into the abyss that had been carved into her back, into her soul. She had been fighting for her life every single day, and he had punished her for winning. His repentance was a cold, silent fire in his chest, burning without heat, without relief. It was not the effusive, weeping regret of a lesser man seeking absolution. He was a king, and his failure was a king's failure, absolute, profound, and demanding not words, but action. Not promises, but proof. An apology would be for his own comfort, a way to alleviate his own crushing guilt, to ease the weight on his own soul. It would be another demand placed upon her, the demand for forgiveness, for her to absolve him, to make him feel better about the inexcusable. He would not inflict that on her. She had borne enough. He had been her tormentor, the latest in what was clearly a long line. Now, he would be her guardian. The world had failed to protect her. Her own father had been her monster. He understood that now with sickening clarity. The king who had negotiated the peace treaty, who had offered his daughter as the price, had been a different kind of monster than Alaric, calculating where Alaric had been blind. Her father had used his daughter as both a political pawn and an outlet for his rages, ensuring she was valuable enough to trade, but broken enough never to challenge him, never to reveal his crimes. The scars were his insurance, a guarantee of her compliance, a promise that she would be grateful for any escape he offered, even one that led to a vampire's castle. And Alaric, her husband, her supposed protector, had continued the abuse with his words, his disdain, his calculated cruelty. It would end. Not just his part in it, but all of it. He would stand between her and the memory of pain. He would build a fortress around her, not of stone and iron, but of peace, of safety, of the gentle certainty that no hand would ever be raised against her again, not even his own, especially not his own. He would give her what she had never had, a sanctuary, a true home. The next morning, the change began. It was subtle at first, a shift in the very atmosphere of the castle, like the first breath of spring after an endless winter. When Celeste finally emerged from her chambers, having spent the night sitting in rigid silence, staring at nothing, her mind unable to process what had happened, clad in a high-necked gown of deep blue velvet that covered every inch of her skin, her face pale but composed, she found the two stern ladies-in-waiting, who had been her constant, critical shadows, were gone. Vanished. In their place was a single, older servant named Ilara, a woman with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, and hands that did not hover or correct, who simply curtsied and asked, in a gentle voice, if the queen desired breakfast. When Celeste, out of habit and the desperate need for routine, requested a tray be brought to the oppressive dining hall, with its long, empty table and cold, judgmental silence, Ilara gently informed her that the king had given orders. The small, disused solarium on the eastern tower, a room that had been shuttered and forgotten for decades, had been opened and aired. A table had been set for her there. Alone, in sunlight. Celeste walked to the solarium as if in a dream, her feet moving without conscious thought, expecting a trick, another test, another way for him to demonstrate her failures. She found a circular room encased in glass panes that had been scrubbed clean until they sparkled, allowing the weak morning sun, a rarity in this land of eternal twilight, to pour in like liquid gold, a miracle, a benediction. The air was fresh, smelling of lemon oil and damp earth and possibility. In the center of the room, a small table was laid with a simple white cloth, and on it was not the heavy, bland fare of the court, the blood-darkened meats and bitter roots, but a bowl of fresh berries, warm bread that smelled of yeast and comfort, a pot of golden honey, and a small pitcher of milk still cool from the cold room. Foods of her homeland, foods she had not tasted in 6 months, foods she had never mentioned, never asked for, believing them forever lost to her. She stood in the doorway for a long time, her hand gripping the cold stone until her knuckles went white, her heart a confused, frightened bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She did not understand. She had expected rage, punishment for the scene the night before, for the exposure of her secret shame, for being damaged goods. She did not know what to do with this quiet, baffling kindness, this evidence that he had paid attention, that he had cared enough to ask, to learn, to provide. It felt like a trap. It felt like hope. She did not know which was more terrifying. She had later discovered he had summoned the servants who had accompanied her from her homeland, the ones he had dismissed upon her arrival as unnecessary. He had asked them in detail about every comfort she had known before him. The list of his failures, she imagined, had been devastatingly long. The changes continued, silent and steady as a rising tide. Over the next week, the solarium became hers, truly hers, the first space she had ever owned. Crates of rich, dark soil appeared at the door, followed by seedlings carefully wrapped in damp burlap. Roses, lavender, jasmine, and a dozen other flowers whose names she knew from her childhood, from the small garden her mother had tended before her death. No one told her they were for her, but they were left with small gardening tools, a pair of leather gloves that fit her hands perfectly, and she understood. The gift was not demanded or announced. It simply was. She spent hours there, her hands in the dirt, the feeling of creation, of nurturing something from seed to bloom, a balm to her battered soul. The act of tending, of watching something grow under her care, was a kind of magic she had forgotten existed. The castle library, which had been filled with grim histories of vampire wars and dense treaties on nocturnal law, suddenly had new shelves installed overnight. They were stocked with poetry, Rumi and Keats and Dickinson, with novels of adventure and romance, with books whose pages were filled not with war and politics, but with sunlight and laughter and improbable happy endings. Books that believed in joy. Alaric remained a ghost, a presence felt but never seen. She did not encounter him in the halls, did not hear his voice. He took his meals in his study, and their vast connecting chambers remained divided by the silent, perpetually closed door, a boundary he would not cross. Yet his presence was everywhere, tangible in its absence. Fresh flowers appeared in her rooms each morning, not the elaborate, showy arrangements meant to impress, but simple bunches of wildflowers and herbs that smelled of meadows and sunshine. Soft wool blankets in shades of cream and blue were left draped over the chairs in the solarium. The guards, who had once regarded her with barely concealed contempt, now bowed to her not with stiff formality, but with a new, profound respect that bordered on reverence. He was reshaping his world around her, recalibrating its every facet for her comfort, for her peace, for her healing. He was giving her space. He was giving her light. He was giving her a choice. The choice to exist without his demands, without his judgment, without his presence. It was the opposite of everything he had done before, and it terrified her almost as much as his cruelty had, because she did not know what it meant, what he wanted, what would happen when he finally decided she had been tested enough. Nearly 3 weeks after that terrible night, 3 weeks of silence and strange, gentle gifts, he finally sought her out. She was in the solarium, tending to a climbing rose that was just beginning to bud, tiny promises of red blooms nestled among the thorns. She heard the soft, deliberate sound of his boots on the stone floor, a sound he was making intentionally so as not to startle her, and her entire body went rigid. Her fingers tightened on the vine, a thorn pricking her thumb, drawing a bead of blood. The memory of his hand in her dress, the sound of the tearing silk, the violation of exposure, was still a raw, vivid thing that lived just beneath her skin. He did not approach her directly. He stopped just inside the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray light of the corridor. And he remained there, giving her distance, giving her control. He was dressed not in his formal, severe black tunic, with its silver fastenings and heavy collar, but in a simple gray shirt and dark trousers, the attire of a man at rest, not a king on his throne. The effect was disarming, almost shocking. He looked younger somehow, more human. "The roses," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its usual sharp, authoritative edge. It was almost tentative. "They seem to be thriving under your care." Celeste could not bring herself to turn around. She stared at the tiny green buds on the vine, forcing herself to breathe, to remain present. "They enjoy the sun," she managed, her own voice a thin whisper, barely audible. "They need the light to grow." "Yes," he said, and there was something in his tone, a weariness, a profound sadness, that made her chest ache. "I had forgotten how much life depends upon it, how much beauty requires light." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the whisper of the wind against the glass, the distant cry of a bird. Celeste's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped thing. She waited for the lecture, the command, the criticism, the inevitable return to the way things were. It was all she had ever known from him, the only language they had shared. "I have received a new missive from the Sunstone Confederacy," he continued, his tone carefully conversational, measured. "They wish to renegotiate the trade tariffs on their grain exports. They believe the original terms to be unfavorable to their interests." This was new, shockingly new. He had never discussed matters of state with her, never sought her counsel. He had made it excruciatingly clear that he considered her incapable of grasping them, too flighty and empty-headed to understand the complexities of governance. She risked a glance over her shoulder, her neck stiff with tension. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes holding a depth she had never seen before, a vulnerability that seemed impossible. There was no mockery in his gaze, no impatience, no barely concealed contempt. There was only a quiet, steady regard, and something that looked almost like hope. "My father always said they were grasping merchants hiding in politicians' robes," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them, before she could remember to be silent and small. It was a thought, an opinion, something her father had said during one of his rare moments of lucidity between rages. She had never been allowed one before, never been permitted to voice her own views. She tensed, her breath catching, expecting a rebuke for her impertinence, for daring to speak. Alaric was silent for a long moment that felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, a faint, almost imperceptible softening occurred around his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Your father was a brute," he said, the words blunt, factual, and utterly devoid of malice. There was only a cold, hard truth in them. A monster who should have protected you and chose to harm you instead. But it seems even a brute can occasionally speak the truth about other men's greed. He held out a rolled scroll tied with a simple ribbon, extending it toward her across the space between them. "I thought you might wish to read the proposal yourself. Your insights on their grasping nature could be valuable to our response. I would welcome your counsel, if you are willing to give it." She stared at the scroll, then at him, her mind struggling to comprehend what was happening. He was offering her a voice. He was offering her a place not just as an ornament in his castle, a decoration to be displayed, but as a mind in his council, a partner in governance. It was more terrifying and more tempting than anything she had ever known. It meant being seen, truly seen, in a way she never had been. It meant risking being known. Slowly, her hands trembling slightly, she wiped the soil from her fingers onto a nearby cloth and walked toward him. Her legs felt unsteady, as if the floor beneath her had become uncertain. As she reached for the scroll, her fingers brushed against his. His skin was cool, as it always was, the touch of something not quite mortal. But there was no threat in the contact, no possession. Only stillness, only an offering. She took the scroll, her eyes fixed on his face, searching for the trap, for the moment when the mask would fall away and she would see the cruel king again. There was none. There was only a profound, weary sadness in his eyes that seemed to span centuries, and a resolve as hard and unyielding as the mountain his castle was built upon. He was not asking for her forgiveness. He was too wise, or too ashamed, to demand that of her. He was showing her his atonement through action, through change, through the slow, patient work of rebuilding what he had destroyed. And in that quiet, sun-filled room, surrounded by the scent of earth and new life and possibility, Celeste felt the first, tentative unfurling of a feeling she had long believed dead, crushed beneath years of pain. It was not trust. Not yet. Trust was a luxury she could not afford, a bridge too far to cross in a single moment. But it was the barest, most fragile glimmer of possibility, the smallest seed of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she might one day be safe. That perhaps the man standing before her, so carefully maintaining his distance, was capable of change. That perhaps she could learn to live and not just survive. The change in Alaric's demeanor sent ripples through the stone heart of his court like an earthquake through bedrock. Where once the king's gaze would slide over his human queen with dismissive coolness, with the indifference one might show a piece of furniture, it now lingered with a watchful, unnerving intensity. He did not touch her. He maintained a careful, respectful distance at all times, and he did not address her with any endearments or false intimacy. But his focus was absolute, unwavering. If she shivered even slightly in a drafty hall, a servant would appear within moments bearing a heavy cloak lined with fur. If a courtier spoke over her, cutting off her words mid-sentence, Alaric's silence would fall upon the conversation with the weight of a guillotine, heavy and final, until the room grew so uncomfortable that the offender would stammer an apology and she was allowed to finish her thought. He had become her shadow, a silent, ever-present guardian whose vigilance was absolute and uncompromising. The court, masters of observing the subtle currents of power, of reading the unspoken language of gesture and glance, took note with growing alarm. The whispers about the flighty, foolish human queen died away like smoke in wind, replaced by a confused, wary respect. She was no longer viewed as the king's mistake, but as something precious and untouchable, sacred in a way they didn't fully understand, but dared not question. The morning after Valerius's departure, Alaric had summoned his entire court to the great hall. His words had been few, but carved in stone. The queen is under my protection. Any disrespect shown to her, any slight, however small, will be considered a personal offense against me, and will be answered as such. The two dismissed ladies-in-waiting were nowhere to be seen, and no one dared ask their fate. The message was clear. The old order had ended, a new one had begun. Celeste found herself breathing more easily with each passing day, as if a weight had been slowly lifted from her chest. The constant, crushing pressure of his disapproval had lifted, and in its absence, she felt a strange lightness that was entirely her own. Not a performance, not a defense mechanism. It was genuine. She spent her days in the solarium, which was now a riot of green life. Roses climbing toward the glass ceiling, lavender spilling from terracotta pots, herbs scenting the air with rosemary and thyme. Or in the library, poring over the trade documents he gave her, making notes in the margins in her careful, precise handwriting. Her observations, which she left for him on his desk in tentative, spidery script, always with the fear that she had overstepped, that she had presumed too much, were always gone by morning. And sometimes a new document would be left in their place. His silent acknowledgement of her contribution, his way of saying that her voice mattered, that her thoughts had value. They were building a new language between them, one of gestures and shared spaces, of things left unsaid but deeply understood. It was fragile and strange and precious. The first true test of this fragile new world came with the arrival of Lord Valerius from the Obsidian Duchy, a rival vampire clan known for their ancient lineage and their barely concealed contempt for Alaric's treaty with the human kingdoms. Valerius was everything Alaric was not, ostentatiously charming, his words dripping with a false, cloying sweetness that failed to mask the predatory glitter in his coal-black eyes. He saw Celeste as the embodiment of Alaric's weakness, a human pet acquired at the cost of vampiric pride, a living symbol of his rival's diminished status. At the formal dinner held in Valerius's honor, the tension was a palpable, living thing that coiled around the room like smoke. Alaric was a study in stillness at the head of the great table, his face carved from ice, revealing nothing, while Valerius dominated the conversation with tales of conquest and casual cruelty, each story designed to highlight the glory of vampire supremacy over human frailty. Celeste sat at Alaric's right, a position of honor she had never been granted before, a small island of color in her gown of pale gold against a sea of black and gray court attire. She remained quiet, observing the dangerous dance of power between the two vampire lords, feeling the undercurrents that could so easily turn deadly. Valerius finally turned his attention to her, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across his handsome face like oil on water. "And the lovely Queen Celeste," he purred, his voice carrying down the length of the table, ensuring every ear could hear. "She is even more delicate than the stories claim. Tell me, Your Majesty, do you not find our world cold, harsh? Does your fragile heart not yearn for the warmth of the sun, for the fleeting, pointless passions of your kind, for the simple, uncomplicated joys of mortality?" Every eye in the hall turned to her, a weight of expectation and judgment. It was a direct challenge, a public dismissal of her standing and her worth, designed to humiliate and diminish. Before Alaric's transformation, in the old days that felt like a lifetime ago, he might have agreed with Valerius, his own barb adding to her humiliation, perhaps even laughing at her expense. Celeste felt the familiar chill of fear, the instinct honed over years to shrink, to make herself small, to smile brightly and deflect with a meaningless, self-deprecating pleasantry that would satisfy the aggressor. But then she felt it, Alaric's gaze upon her. It was not on Valerius, not engaged in the masculine posturing of rival lords. It was on her, steady and calm and utterly focused. It was a silent question, a granting of permission, a promise of protection. "Speak," it seemed to say. "Your voice is your own. I am here." Drawing a steadying breath, feeling her heart pound but refusing to let fear rule her, she met Valerius's mocking stare with a level gaze. "I find, my lord," she said, her voice clear and steady, stronger than she had ever heard it, "that warmth is not a matter of climate or circumstance, but of company. And I have found the company here to be illuminating. I have learned more in these halls than I ever knew in the sunlight." A collective sharp intake of breath hissed through the hall like wind through a crypt. It was a polite but unmistakable rebuke. She had turned his insult into a compliment for her adopted home, had claimed her place here by choice rather than submission. Valerius's smile tightened, the charm falling away for just a moment to reveal the viper beneath. "Illuminating? An interesting choice of words for a realm of darkness. I would have thought a creature of the day would find our eternal night rather confining, oppressive even. But perhaps you have been taught your place in the shadows well. A pretty bird is prettiest in its cage, is it not, Alaric?" He directed the last part to the king, a goad wrapped in a sneer, a deliberate provocation. Alaric did not move. He did not even blink. He simply continued to look at his wife with that same steady, unwavering focus, giving her the space to fight her own battle while making it clear, to everyone watching, that she was not alone. Celeste felt a surge of courage rise in her chest, warm and bright. "My husband has not built me a cage, Lord Valerius," Celeste said, her voice gaining strength, resonating with a conviction that surprised even her. "He has given me a sanctuary. There is a profound difference between the two. A cage is for a possession, something owned and controlled. A sanctuary is for something treasured, something protected, something cherished." The silence that followed was absolute and ringing. Valerius's face contorted in a brief flash of pure fury, quickly masked. He had meant to humiliate the human queen, and through her, to wound Alaric's pride, to expose him as weak before his own court. Instead, she had turned his own metaphor against him, with a grace and strength no one had expected, least of all him. She had claimed not just her place, but Alaric's protection as a mark of honor, not shame. Valerius had lost, and every vampire in the room knew it. The power dynamic had shifted beneath his feet. Alaric, still silent, allowed the faintest ghost of a smile to touch his lips. Not triumphant, but proud. Proud of her. Later that night, the fragile peace was shattered like glass against stone. A commotion erupted in the halls, the sound of a struggle, boots scuffling on stone, a sharp, quickly cut-off cry. Alaric was gone from their chambers in an instant, a blur of silent, lethal motion, moving with the inhuman speed of his kind. Celeste was left alone, her heart pounding wildly, her mind racing through terrible possibilities. Ilara, the kind-eyed servant who had become her constant companion, appeared at her door moments later, her face ashen with fear. "Stay here, Your Majesty," she whispered urgently. "Lock the door. The king commands it." The wait was an eternity measured in shallow breaths and racing thoughts. The sounds from the corridor had ceased, replaced by a heavy, ominous silence that was somehow worse than the violence had been. When Alaric finally returned, hours later, as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern sky, he was not the same man who had left. There was a single, dark smear of blood on his cheekbone, not his own, and his eyes held the cold, flat emptiness of a starless night, the ancient predator fully revealed. He moved with a terrifying economy of motion, every line of his body radiating a tightly controlled, deadly rage that made the air itself feel dangerous. "What happened?" Celeste whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. Fear clawed at her throat, not fear of him, but fear for what had occurred, what had been threatened. He walked to the basin in the corner of the room and splashed water on his face, washing away the blood with methodical precision. He did not look at her, his jaw tight. "Valerius has a clumsy sense of ambition and an even clumsier sense of subtlety," he said, his voice a low, flat monotone devoid of any emotion. "His guards were found lurking near your chambers. They claimed they were lost in the castle's corridors." He spat the word as if it were poison. The lie was transparent. The intent was clear: to test my defenses, to gauge my commitment to you, perhaps even to create an accident. It was an insult wrapped in plausible deniability. The blood drained from Celeste's face, leaving her dizzy. They had come for her. Assassins or kidnappers, sent by a rival lord to use her as a pawn, a hostage, a tool. The thought was so monstrous, so direct and brutal, that she felt her knees weaken. She gripped the back of a chair for support. "They did not succeed," Alaric said, his voice still that terrible, empty monotone. He turned to face her then, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch in her throat. It was the look of the apex predator she had first met, the ancient vampire king in all his terrible glory. But it was not directed at her. It was a promise of annihilation directed outward, at the world, at anyone who would dare harm her. It was protection made manifest, fierce and absolute. "They will never threaten you again. No one will." "And Lord Valerius?" she asked, her voice barely audible, though she already knew the answer in her bones. "He is no longer a guest in my castle. He is no longer anywhere." The finality in his tone, the cold certainty, left no room for questions, no space for doubt. He had not merely ejected Valerius from his lands, he had erased him, removed the threat completely and utterly. This swift, silent, and utterly ruthless act of violence was not the act of a tyrant lashing out. It was the act of a shield, an immovable barrier between her and harm. He had killed, without hesitation and without remorse, to protect her. He had seen a threat to her safety, and he had eliminated it with the efficiency of a predator and the devotion of a guardian. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped before her, so close she could feel the cold radiating from his skin like winter air, could see the fathomless depth of his ancient eyes, the weight of centuries in them. He slowly, deliberately, lifted a hand toward her face, perhaps to touch her cheek, perhaps simply to reassure her. She flinched, an involuntary recoil born of a lifetime of pain, of hands that hurt, of touch that meant violence. She couldn't help it. The instinct was bone deep. His hand froze in midair, suspended between them. The expression on his face was one of profound, soul-deep pain, a grief so vast it seemed to swallow him whole. He had forgotten, for a single moment, that his hands had once been a source of her fear, that touch was not comfort to her, but a potential threat. The reminder cut him more deeply than any blade ever could. He let his hand fall slowly to his side, the movement careful, deliberate. "I will not fail you again, Celeste," he said. And the words were not an apology. Apologies were too cheap, too easy for what he had done. They were a vow, a sacrament, a blood oath spoken in the gray light of dawn. "Never again. I swear it on my immortal soul. No one will ever harm you. Not while I draw breath. Not while I exist." It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, stripped of pretense or pride. It was a promise, written in blood and shadow and absolute conviction. In that moment, standing in the aftermath of violence committed in her name, Celeste saw him completely and without illusion. The cruel king who had tormented her, the penitent man consumed by regret, the lethal protector who would kill without hesitation to keep her safe. They were all him, all facets of the same complex, contradictory being, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost painful, that the same terrifying power he had once turned against her was now her absolute and unconditional shield. He had made himself her sword and her fortress, her guardian against a world that had always sought to break her. She took a small, hesitant step forward, closing the distance he had so carefully maintained for weeks. And for the first time since that terrible night when her dress had been torn and her secrets laid bare, without flinching, without forethought, without the weight of fear holding her back, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. His muscles were like stone beneath her palm, coiled and tense, but he did not move, did not even seem to breathe. He stood utterly still, as if her touch were something sacred, something he did not deserve but would treasure nonetheless. It was a small gesture, barely anything at all, but in the quiet stillness of the dawn, in a castle built of shadows and ancient stone, it felt like the sun rising for the first time in 1,000 years. The aftermath of Valerius's failed gambit and his complete and permanent disappearance settled over the castle like a fine, chilling dust, an unspoken understanding that passed through the halls like wind. His entire delegation was gone before the sun fully rose, their departure as silent and absolute as their lord's fate. There were no explanations given, no announcements made, but none were needed. A message had been sent, written in blood and shadow, and the kind of silence that spoke volumes. The human queen was not a weakness to be exploited, not a vulnerability in the king's armor, but the sanctified heart of the nocturne court itself. And her king was her sworn, lethal guardian, a force of nature that would destroy anyone who threatened her. The court's wariness of Celeste transformed overnight into something deeper, a profound, almost religious awe. They looked at her now and saw not a fragile human out of her depth, but the anchor of their formidable king's soul, the living embodiment of his capacity for devotion. She had become untouchable in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the understanding that she was cherished beyond measure. For Celeste, the act of violence committed in her name was a strange and complex thing to reconcile. It terrified her, the casual way Alaric could unmake a powerful lord, the cold finality of it, the ease with which he had ended a life, perhaps multiple lives. The violence was real and brutal and inescapable. But beneath the fear, growing stronger with each passing hour, was a feeling she hadn't realized she'd been starved of her entire life. Safety. True, unconditional, unshakable safety. Her father's house had been a place of unpredictable terror, where any moment could bring pain. Alaric's castle had been a gilded prison of emotional cruelty, where her spirit was under constant assault. Now, slowly, it was becoming something else entirely. A fortress, a sanctuary, a home. Her hand on his arm that morning had broken a seal, shattered a barrier that had kept them apart. The careful distance he had maintained for weeks, the deliberate space he had given her to heal, was breached. Not by his will or his demand, but by her offering. He did not pull away from her touch. He did not presume to ask for more. He simply stood there, under her hand, as if he were the one made of glass, as if her touch were the most precious thing in his long existence. From that day on, the space between them began to shrink, slowly, cautiously, carefully, like a winter landscape thawing one tentative inch at a time, like ice melting in the first warmth of spring. They began to talk. Not of the past. That remained a haunted, silent territory between them, a landscape too dangerous to traverse, minds buried beneath the soil that neither was ready to disturb. But they spoke of the present, of the small moments that made up their days. He would join her in the solarium, not speaking at first, simply sitting in a chair in the corner, reading a book while she tended her plants, their silence a companionable thing. Then he started asking questions, in that careful, measured way of his. He asked about the flowers she was planting, their names, the kind of light they needed, how to tell when soil was too wet or too dry. He listened with an unnerving stillness as she spoke of growing things, her voice losing its hesitant edge as she talked about something she loved, something that brought her joy. One afternoon, as she worked, she was humming that same little tune he had once despised, the sound rising from her throat without thought. She caught herself mid-note, her throat tightening in an automatic, fearful apology, her hand freezing on the plant she was tending. The old fear rose up. She was being annoying, frivolous, thoughtless. "Don't stop," he said softly, his voice barely above a murmur. He didn't look up from his book, giving her the gift of privacy in her vulnerability. "It's pleasant. I find I've grown quite fond of it." She stared at the back of his head, at the fall of his dark hair against the collar of his shirt, her heart doing a slow, painful somersault in her chest. He had taken the sound that had once been the symbol of her infuriating frivolity, the noise he had mocked and despised, and named it pleasant. He was not just protecting her body from harm, he was protecting her spirit, her essence, the very core of who she was. He was tending to the lightness he had once sworn to extinguish, nurturing it like one of her roses. Their evenings changed as well, evolving into a ritual she found herself looking forward to with increasing anticipation. Instead of dining separately in their respective silences, they took their meals together, often in the library rather than the oppressive great hall. A small table set up near the fireplace, where flames danced and cast warm shadows. He would read to her, his deep, resonant voice, giving life to tales of ancient heroes and forgotten magic, of love and loss and redemption. She would listen, curled in a large armchair with a blanket across her lap, and for the first time since she was a small child before her mother's death, she felt the simple, profound comfort of being cared for without condition, without price. He began to see the world through her eyes, and it transformed him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He, who had walked the earth for centuries and seen empires rise and crumble to dust, who had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations, found himself captivated by the small things she noticed and celebrated. The way the moonlight patterned the flagstones in geometric beauty, the intricate, perfect design of a spider's web jeweled with morning dew in the corner of a window, the changing colors of the sky at dusk, from gray to lavender to deep purple, a spectacle he had long ago ceased to notice. She was teaching him to see beauty in the ephemeral, the quiet magic in the mundane, the extraordinary hidden within the ordinary. Her flightiness was not a lack of focus or depth, but an abundance of it, a rare capacity to find wonder in a world that he had long ago dismissed as static and unchanging, eternal and therefore meaningless. She made the world new again. His repentance continued, a quiet, daily litany of actions and attentions. He learned her fears through careful observation. A raised voice, a sudden movement in her peripheral vision, the sound of shattering glass. And he meticulously purged them from her environment with the same ruthless efficiency he had once used to control her. The servants learned to move quietly, to speak in low, gentle tones. When a clumsy stable boy dropped a stack of metal plates in the courtyard one afternoon, the sound ringing out like thunder, Alaric was at her side in an instant. Not to see what the commotion was, not to punish the careless servant, but to watch her. His body tensed and ready, prepared to shield her from the memory the sound might evoke, the flashback it might trigger. Celeste, in turn, began to understand the crushing weight of his immortality, the profound loneliness of a king who could trust no one, who watched everyone he might care for age and die while he remained unchanged. She saw the weariness in his eyes that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Vampires did not tire in that way, but everything to do with the exhaustion of centuries. She saw that his control, his severity, the walls he had built around himself, were their own kind of shield, a way to keep a world that was always changing, always dying, always leaving him behind, at a safe emotional distance. They were two lonely souls, scarred in different ways by the worlds that had made them, finding unexpected solace in each other. One night, as a cold rain wept against the library windows and the fire crackled softly, she looked up from the book he was reading, a tale of star-crossed lovers separated by war, and truly saw him. Not the monster from her nightmares, not the cruel king who had tormented her, not even the echo of her father's violence. He was a man, flawed and ancient and impossibly complex, who had made a terrible mistake and had dedicated his entire existence to atoning for it. He had seen the worst of her, the secret she had believed made her unlovable and broken and damaged beyond repair, and instead of casting her aside as worthless, he had remade his entire world to keep that broken part of her safe, to treasure it. Alaric, she said softly, the name feeling different in her mouth now, intimate rather than formal. He stopped reading mid-sentence, lifting his gaze from the page, his dark eyes finding hers. Yes, Celeste? She hesitated, the words she wanted to say feeling too large, too momentous for the quiet room, too heavy with meaning. Thank you, she whispered instead, her voice thick with emotions she didn't have names for. He knew immediately what she was thanking him for. It wasn't for the flowers that appeared daily in her rooms, or the books that lined her shelves, or the protection he offered so fiercely. It was for the seeing, for understanding that her scars were not her shame, but her story, for recognizing that her survival was not weakness, but the most profound kind of strength. A small, sad smile touched his lips, filled with regret and tenderness in equal measure. There is nothing to thank me for, Celeste. I am merely trying to be a man worthy of the sanctuary you have built in this castle. He gestured vaguely with his hand, encompassing her, the flowers in the solarium, the books, the light she had brought to his world of shadows. He meant her presence, her spirit, her light that refused to be extinguished. She rose from her chair, setting the blanket aside, and went to him with a deliberateness that surprised them both. She knelt on the floor beside his seat, the stone cold beneath her knees. He watched her, his entire body going tense, every muscle coiled, but he did not move away. He barely seemed to breathe. She took his hand, the same hand that had torn her dress, that had revealed her secrets, that had been an instrument of cruelty, and brought it to her cheek, pressing his palm against her skin. She held it there, feeling the coolness of his touch, so different from the warmth of her own flesh. And it did not feel like a threat. It felt like an anchor. It felt like home. You are, she said, her voice thick with emotion, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You are worthy. You are. He closed his eyes, and a shudder passed through his powerful frame, a tremor that seemed to come from his very soul. It was the closest to complete surrender she had ever seen from him, a moment of absolute vulnerability. When he opened his eyes again, the weariness was gone, replaced by a raw, unguarded tenderness that stole her breath and made her heart ache. He gently freed his hand from her grasp, only to cup her face with both hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones with an impossible reverence, as if she were made of starlight and dreams. He was not just touching her skin, he was touching her soul, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in all his long existence. I almost destroyed the most precious thing I have ever known, he murmured, his voice rough with a grief that was centuries old, a pain that had no bottom. I will spend the rest of eternity making sure I never make that mistake again. I swear it, Celeste. I swear it on everything I am. In that moment, they were not a vampire king and a human queen, not captor and captive, not two people bound by a political treaty. They were simply Alaric and Celeste, two broken people who had, against all odds, against all reason, found a way to start healing each other. The past was not gone, and its ghosts would never fully disappear, but they were finally beginning to recede, chased away by the steady, quiet light of something neither had expected to find. A love that had been born from the ashes of a terrible mistake, forged in the fire of repentance, and tempered by the hard work of becoming better. He leaned down, and she leaned up, meeting him halfway. And in the warm, golden glow of the firelight, surrounded by books and the soft sound of rain and the promise of tomorrow, he finally kissed his wife. Not with the possessive force of a king claiming his property, not with the entitlement of ownership, but with the gentle, soul-deep reverence of a man who had finally found his grace, his redemption, his reason to believe in the possibility of goodness. And she kissed him back, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty, choosing him as he had chosen to become worthy of her. It was a beginning. Not an ending, not an erasure of all that had come before, but a beginning. And sometimes that is all we need.